Good morning. In 2008, my wife Rhoda and I visited the Holy Land with O'Call Holidays. It was an amazing trip, and for me, one of the highlights was the visit to Bethlehem. The city of Bethlehem is situated just over 6 miles south of Jerusalem. During our time there, we visited the Church of the Nativity, and our guide pointed us to a star on the floor and told us this is the spot where Jesus was born. There's no way of knowing for sure where the stable was in the then town of Bethlehem. During this year's Advent season, I'm planning to speak to you from the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. Now, I know that this isn't normally regarded as an Advent book like the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, where we find the actual details of the Christmas story. We read about Joseph and Mary, the angels, the shepherds, the wise men, the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. But on this first Sunday in Advent, when we light the first candle on our Advent wreath, we traditionally look back to the Old Testament prophecies, which speak to us about the birth and incarnation of the Lord Jesus. The Christmas story has deep roots which are clearly seen in the Old Testament. Christ is seen right throughout the Old Testament. We read about Jesus in Genesis, Leviticus, Psalms, the major and minor prophets. So I want to take a look at this book of Ruth, this Advent season, and read it as the Christmas story, because this book of Ruth contains only 4 chapters, and it focuses in on a few main characters and the part they played in God's amazing plan to eventually save the world through Jesus. The second reason I want to look at this book of Ruth is that the events recorded in the book of Ruth have a clear connection to the events of Christmas. It's no coincidence that the story of Ruth and the events of Christmas both take place in the town of Bethlehem. We'll see that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Because of that, what takes place in the book of Ruth? There's a real connection between the book of Ruth and the Christmas story. And the third reason is we'll see some remarkable parallels between the story of Ruth and the Christmas story. The Christmas story is a story about a young woman called Mary, who was called to make a commitment of faith to God, which led her on a journey to Bethlehem, where she gave birth to a child who would change the world. Ruth is also the story of a young woman. Ruth made a commitment of faith to God, which involved a journey to Bethlehem, where she gave birth to a child who would also change the world. So let's begin our Advent journey this morning by taking a look at Ruth chapter 1. And the first thing we see is they flee Bethlehem. The book of Ruth is a story of a woman who makes a commitment of faith to God, then goes to Bethlehem, where she gives birth to a child who would change the world. Ruth would not be the obvious choice for such a role. For one thing, Ruth wasn't even a Jew. She was from Moab, and the Moabites were the enemies of Israel. So how did this young woman come to have faith in God? How did she end up in Bethlehem? Well, to answer these questions, we need to look at Ruth chapter 1. Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. We're told, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So the story of Ruth begins with this family leaving Bethlehem. And in the Christmas story, we also read about a family leaving Bethlehem. Ruth chapter 1 verse 1 says, the story is situated in the days when the judges ruled. Right at the very end of the book of Judges, Judges chapter 1 verse 25, it tells us 2 important facts about this period when the judges reigned. In those days, Israel had no king. and everyone did as he saw fit. The period of the Judges was a period in Israel's history when the people of God were not following God's commands. And that's why the family in Bethlehem was not a coincidence. It was a part of God's plan to bring his people back to him. Naomi and her family left Bethlehem to escape the famine. The famine was a consequence of disobedience. And that's why they traveled to the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, to the land of Moab. I believe this was only intended to be a temporary measure. But once they'd settled in, Moab became their new home. And sadly, as we'll see, things didn't go any better for Naomi and her family in Moab than they had done in Bethlehem. Verse 3. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Naomi left Bethlehem to escape trouble, to escape the famine, but she ended up losing her husband and her 2 sons in Moab. And so we see the book of Ruth opens with a series of terrible losses for Naomi. She left her homeland. She lost her husband. She lost both her sons. You could say Naomi lost everything when she left Bethlehem. In the Christmas story, we also read about a family fleeing Bethlehem, which also involves a terrible loss. After Jesus was born and the Magi had come to worship him, we read in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13 following, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said to the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Naomi and her daughters-in-law and the people of Bethlehem were no strangers to loss. This year in our country, due to the coronavirus, there are many people struggling with loss this Christmas time. We know that the Bible tells us that God works in our lives even in the most difficult of circumstances. Romans 8 verse 28. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can see how God was working in Naomi's life, even though she could not see it at the time. God would bring good out of her suffering, and he would do that through a young Moabite woman whose name was Ruth. So we see them fleeing from Bethlehem. The second thing we see is Ruth's faith. We're told in verse 4, Ruth married one of Naomi's sons. But after Ruth's husband, her brother-in-law, and her father-in-law had died, Naomi decides to go home to Bethlehem. And here we see Ruth making a commitment of faith that will change everything for Naomi and the whole world. In verse 6, we're told that Naomi has heard that the famine is over in Israel. So she prepares to return home to Bethlehem. And at first, her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, they begin the journey with her. But somewhere along the way, Naomi tells them to go back to Moab. After a long discussion, Orpah agrees with Naomi and returns back to her own people and her own gods. But Ruth is adamant. She will not leave Naomi. Naomi pleads with her in verse 15. Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. And this is when Naomi makes her commitment of faith. Look at verse 16. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you from me. We see here how Ruth commits herself to Naomi and Naomi's people, but most of all, she commits herself to Naomi's God. In recent weeks and months, we've been studying Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. We have seen how the Thessalonians turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. 1 Thessalonians 1:9. And that's exactly what Ruth does here. Orpah went back to her people and her gods, but Ruth breaks away from her people and their false gods. She commits herself in faith to the Lord, the God of Israel. This was a lifelong commitment. She wasn't just committing herself to take care of Naomi while she's alive. Ruth is committed to serving the Lord in Israel for the rest of her own life. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Ruth is choosing to be buried with God's people rather than with her own ancestors. This was a real commitment of faith to the Lord, which would not only change Ruth and Naomi's lives, but would have repercussions that would change the world. Ruth's faith in God reminds me so much of another young woman's commitment of faith that changed the world. I'm thinking about Mary, the mother of Jesus in the New Testament. Mary was just a young woman, probably a teenager, when God sent the angel Gabriel to tell her some startling news. Luke chapter 1, verse 30. The angel told her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end." "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I am a virgin?" The angel answered her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God, for nothing is impossible with God." How did Mary respond to Gabriel's words? Well, listen to her words of faith in Luke 1:38. "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May it be to me as you have said." Then the angel left her. Mary not only believed what the angel had told her, but she submitted to his word in obedience. This was an obedience that would endanger her life. It would harm her reputation. It would risk losing her relationship with Joseph, to whom she was engaged to be married. Mary laid it all on the line, just like Ruth. She made a commitment of faith that changed the world. If we want to make a difference, we need to be men and women of faith. We cannot accomplish anything of real significance without faith in God. Now, we may not change the world like Ruth or Mary, but when you put your faith in God, it will change your world. Like Mary and Ruth, we need to be people who make a real commitment of faith to God. And thirdly, we see the return to Bethlehem. We pick up the story in chapter 1, verse 18. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" When Naomi arrives in Bethlehem with Ruth, the whole town could hardly believe their eyes. Could this really be Naomi, back again after all these years? In the Christmas story, we also read about a town that was amazed and disturbed. Matthew 2, verses 1-6. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born, King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them whether Christ was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. We see here that the whole city of Jerusalem was disturbed by the news that the Messiah, a new king, had been born. And they knew the location, in Bethlehem in Judea, for this is what the prophet has written. Bethlehem was only 6 miles away, and yet we don't read that anyone bothered to make the trip to see the newborn king. Isn't it amazing? When Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was amazed because of them. And the woman exclaimed in chapter 1, verse 19, can this be Naomi? To which Naomi replies, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. The name Naomi means pleasant, but the name Mara means bitter. Naomi had left Bethlehem more than 10 years earlier, full of hope for the future, with a husband and with 2 sons. And now she returns empty-handed. And so she tells the people in verse 21, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. It's obvious, it's clear that Naomi was hurting when she returned to Bethlehem. She was blaming everything on God. She didn't know that God was working to bring good out of her situation. God was there working all the time, but she just couldn't see it. We come to the last verse of chapter 1. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Chapter 1, verse 22. Naomi said, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. But God continues to call her Naomi anyway, because God has good plans for her, and he continues to call her by her name. We're told that the barley harvest was just beginning. This was a sign of God's grace and new beginnings. And after this dark opening chapter, suddenly there's a chink of light, and you get the sense that things are about to change for Ruth and Naomi. We'll see this next week. So what are some of the parallels between Ruth and the Christmas story? As we've seen, the book of Ruth begins in the period of the Judges, where there was no king in Israel. And the Christmas story is about Jesus, who was born King of the Jews and worshipped by kings from afar. The book of Ruth begins with a famine in Bethlehem, which is ironic because the name Bethlehem means house of bread. But in Naomi's day, there was no bread in Bethlehem. But in the Christmas story, we see that there is bread in Bethlehem. For Jesus, the bread of life, came down from heaven and was born in the house of bread. The book of Ruth is about a young woman who made a commitment of faith to God, then journeyed to Bethlehem, where she gives birth to a child who would change the world. And in the Christmas story, we have a young woman who makes a commitment of faith to God, then journeys to Bethlehem with Joseph, where she too gives birth to a child who would change the world. God was at work in Bethlehem in the days of Ruth and Naomi, just as God was at work in Bethlehem in the days of Joseph and Mary. And God is at work in the lives of all those who come to him through Jesus for salvation. During this Advent season, we will hear many carols being sung. And in the 3rd verse of Philip Brooks' carol, O Little Town of Bethlehem, we read these words. How silently, the wondrous gift is given. So God imparts to human hearts the blessings of his heaven. No ear may hear his coming, but in this world of sin, where meek souls will receive him still, the dear Christ enters in. God has come to us in the person of Jesus. And all we have to do is to reach out to him in faith. My prayer for you this Christmas time is that you would open your hearts to him and know the truth of Emmanuel, God with us. Amen. And now I encourage you to turn and click onto the next link for our closing song this morning. It's the carol, O Little Town of Bethlehem.